What is it that gets in the way? Why the embarrassment? Why the hesitancy to talk about these things? I think maybe the answer is obvious, or maybe it's not obvious. What are the things that sort of discourage us from talking about the elephant in the room? And welcome, my friends, to the Generations Radio broadcast. Kevin Swanson, your host, with you today. We come back to a very important topic. Friends, hey, things have changed so dramatically since the 1970s, since the 1980s, since the 1990s, since the early 2000s. The entire media explosion and the pornography explosion has vastly changed our world. Now, the human heart hasn't changed, but we, I think, need to wake up and smell the napalm, so to speak, in this spiritual war that engages, especially in this area of sexuality and the sexualization of young children. So we need to be very much aware of these sorts of things. It's impossible to escape these realities. And so we're back to this with a very practical program today. We can talk about how bad it is, but at the end of the day, what we really need to do is equip our moms and dads to equip their kids to deal with this sexualized world around us. And so joining me today is Greta Eskridge. She is a homeschool mom of 4 kids, and by the way, homeschooled herself back in the 1980s. I found somebody who's homeschooled herself back in the first generation. Of course, for me, it was the 70s. I graduated in 1981. Greta a little bit after me, but she's also the author of the book, It's Time to Talk to Your Kids About Porn, A Parent's Guide to Helping Children and Teens Develop Sexual Integrity. Greta, welcome to the Generations program. It's good to have you here today.
Oh, thanks for having me on the show. I'm really delighted to be here and to talk to you.
Yeah, and you were homeschooled yourself in the 1980s? In early 90s?
Yeah, 80s and 90s. Yep. Yeah, and I absolutely loved it. I really did.
Is there a sense in which things have changed even since, you were homeschooled in the 1980s? I mean, do you sense, hey, things have changed. We need to wake up and realize some of these changes.
Oh, yeah. I mean, between my career as a homeschooled kid and then a mom who homeschooled her own kids, I was actually a public high school teacher for 5 years.
Okay.
And that was, 20 some odd years ago. And even from then to now, things have changed. And so I think it's really important for all of us to be honest about the world our kids are growing up in so that we can equip them with the best tools possible to be able to navigate a world that wants to drag them down into some really dark places.
Yeah, and we just need to be able to adjust to what's happening around us. Obviously, the principles remain the same. We love our kids. We want the best for them. We want to raise them with a vision for purity and to know Jesus. I mean, these are important, and that was just as important in the 1960s and 1920s and so forth. But the environment, the situation in which we are raising them has changed dramatically. Well, here's just an anecdote. I'll throw this at you, Greta, from the front side. We were at a pizza restaurant Tuesday this week with the grandkids. My 2 grandsons, about 4 years of age, and there's a basketball game going on the TV, in the restaurant. And there's this ad that comes on where these girls are, almost entirely unclothed. It was sort of like this weird moment with a pretty high degree of suggestiveness going on in the ad itself, to the point where I felt uncomfortable, okay? The little boys just seemed confused. They're like, what's this? They're not used to this, right? This is kind of like a shock to their system. I just glanced at them and saw that. And I pointed out that the girls aren't being modest and, hey, yeah, okay, they don't have very many clothes on, etc. So let's not look at them. They sort of covered their eyes and they seemed, again, confused with what was happening. What you're saying in this book is that you want to be sure parents are communicating the right message to the kids.
Yeah, I think for a lot of parents, that situation could happen and they would just kind of ignore it. Like, it happened. We all felt uncomfortable. We noticed it. There were definite questions or confusion on the part of our kids, but how do we even handle it? And so then the temptation is just to ignore it because that feels easiest.
Yeah.
But what I am saying is actually the best thing we can do for our kids is to talk about it, because then it opens up the doors of communication for them as they grow up and they encounter more and more of these types of situations, some of which are going to be much more explicit than a commercial on TV. Mm-hmm. And if we've laid the foundation of this is a family where we can talk about anything, and if you have questions or concerns or something's happened, Dad and I are safe. We want to talk to you. We want to care for you. We want to help you navigate it. That foundation that starts with your little kids is going to be so important as your kids grow up.
Greta, what is it that gets in the way? Why the embarrassment? Why the hesitancy to talk about these things? I think maybe the answer is obvious, or maybe it's not obvious. What are the things that sort of discourage us from talking about the elephant in the room?
Well, I think a lot of us have our own sexual history.
Okay.
And that could be laced with some things that pain or shame, maybe choices we made that we wished we hadn't, or things that were done to us that hurt us. Mm-hmm. And that can play a part in our discomfort in talking to our kids about these issues. Mm-hmm. Or even if that isn't our situation, we made the right choices and we had a really safe childhood and didn't experience that kind of trauma. We still maybe grew up in a home like I did, where we really didn't talk about sex, or certainly not something like pornography. And so I just didn't have the tools to even know how to talk about it myself. Like it just wasn't talked about. And I think that is also a really common scenario for anybody raised in a Christian home in the 80s and 90s. It was like, let's say the least amount possible and move on. Mm-hmm. And that did not equip us to be able to have these kinds of conversations with our own kids.
How do we find the proper balance? On the one hand, there's the ditch of we don't want to give a lesson on porn that describes porn in pornographic detail, or introduce things to a child too early. This is, I think, what's in the mind of most parents, at least that is. And on the other hand, we don't want to avoid important conversations given the world that we live in today. How do we find the proper balance here?
I always like to say that we want to give our kids the least amount of information to keep them the most safe. So just like you said, we don't want to give details about explicit material. We want to give just the minimal amount of information so that if they are exposed to explicit material, they know what to do. But they don't need to know details, just like we wouldn't say to our kid, hey, don't cross the street without me. Because if you did, you could get hit by a car and this is what would happen to you. We wouldn't go into detail about all the horrible effects of them being hit by a car. We would just say, it's dangerous for you to cross the street without me. You could get hit by a car and that would hurt you. So you need to wait for me. It's the same when we talk to our kids about explicit material. We don't go into detail. We just say, this is what you need to do if you see it. And that is the most information they need at that young age. As they grow up and they get older, then we can have more extensive conversations. But that is based on their maturity and their age. And it's a little bit at a time as needed.
Greta, you think the problem is like big? I mean, this thing's all over the place. The normalization of perversion, sexuality outside of marriage, the sexualization of kids. It's out there. I mean, it's more out there than ever. Parents need to be aware of that.
Yeah. Like I've done a lot of research on, for example, the ages that kids are exposed to pornography. Okay. And right now, the average age of a child being exposed to pornography is about 12 years old. But up to 15% of kids, there was a recent survey done by some Common Sense Media, and they did a huge research study on this. And they said up to 15% of kids under the age of 10 are exposed to pornography.
It's a lot.
And that is, like you said, this is a big problem facing our kids, and why as parents, we need to address it when our kids are younger rather than wait till they're teens to talk about it. Because by then it can often be too late. They've already been exposed. They may be dealing with their own issues of shame or fear or discomfort. They may even have return to pornography because no one told them they shouldn't. And so in the ideal world, we would be talking to our kids at a young age. Again, not with great detail, but just with enough information to keep them safe and to make wise choices.
You know, it's interesting. I look back at my own life, way back on the mission field in Japan, where we grew up. The Japanese would actually be fairly public with displays of pornographic images. And it's interesting. Now, I don't, want to diss my parents. They did a great job in so many ways, just like your parents. Okay, great parents, all right. But we never had that conversation. I mean, we didn't. It just was not something that my dad would talk about. And I would say I was probably 13, 14, 15 years of age when I'm on my bike, I'm doing my paper route, and I'm coming across these images that are posted in public places, on the streets in Japan. And so, I'm just saying, here's a kid, okay, growing up in a very fine Christian home in the 1970s, and I mean, this is probably a story for almost every young person. Now, there are families who say, no, we control the media in our home, okay? But I want to throw out something here. Maybe you can add to it. You might be able to control the media in your home, but your kids may have access to media through their friends' iPhones at school or the neighborhood or even in the church. This is Pandora's box. This thing's wide open right now. And I think parents need to be maybe not so naive on this one.
That is such a great example because you're right. Like, you can go through great lengths to control and protect your kids while they're in your home. You can install a router, which, limits the, explicit material that comes into devices on your home, in your home. You can install, accountability software on their screens. You can make sure that they're following all the screen safety rules, like not using a device in their room alone at night and all of those things. And those are great things to do. But like you said, what about when your kid is outside of the home? What about what other people have to access to show them on their devices? Or even what about when they're just out and about in the world? Like, we know that there are advertisements, there are conversations, there is explicit music being played when, they're at the beach or the park. Like, there are opportunities for exposure to all kinds of explicit material all over the place. And I go back always to this idea of, if our kids are exposed and we haven't shown them that they can talk to us about it, come to us with their questions or their concerns or what has happened, then they're just sort of left to figure it out by themselves. And I would say one of the biggest differences between now and when you and I were growing up is, if we had a question and we didn't go to our parents, we went to the encyclopedia for information. Yeah. There was a limit to what we could find out, right? Mm-hmm. There was an end. Mm-hmm. But kids now, if they go on Google, if they go on the internet, there is no limit to what they can find out. And that is a really dangerous situation. Right. And that's why, as parents, we need to tell our kids, like, I'm your Google. If you have a question, ask me. Mm-hmm. Looking for that information on your own is dangerous. You need to come talk to me about it. And because you're right, it is Pandora's box. If they look for it on their own, there is a likelihood they're going to find so much more than they ever imagined, and it's going to be worse than they ever imagined.
Now, you start with some of these basic lessons, like objectification, an important word in the discussion. I do like to, contrast it with the biblical idea of loving others, being respectful of others, versus, lusting after others, using others, abusing others. I think that's one way to put it. How would you bring that to a child? Say, I don't know, a 10, 13-year-old child. How would you describe that?
Well, if we want them to understand that pornography objectifies or uses people, a simple way for them at that age to be able to understand is that you're using people or another person, even a person on a screen, for to I'm trying to think of the right word here. I'm coming up with the blank, surprisingly, with all these conversations I've had. But basically, you're using them for your own selfish gain instead of honoring them, respecting them, loving them as a person made in the image of God, right?
Right. Exactly.
And so when you use another person for your own selfish gain, then you are not treating them the way God would have you treat them. And I think kids understand that because, you know, we're tempted to cut in line as kids, or we're tempted to take the biggest piece of dessert. And that is selfish gain, right? Mm-hmm. Thinking of ourselves first and not considering others. And that's what objectification is. That is what is not honoring another person. And so teaching them in those sort of examples that they can understand that they've experienced themselves and probably have done, and say, you know, when you think about pornography, it is so much worse than, you know, cutting in line or taking more than your fair share, because you're actually hurting another person. Mm-hmm. And you're not respecting them and treating them as a person made in God's image. I think that that's a really important thing that kids need to understand, that we're all made in God's image and therefore worthy of respect and honor.
You know, it's interesting also that some have tried to justify pornography or generic figures of cartoon characters in pornographic imagery. And you bring out anime in your book, and I think that's really, really important. Hentai in Japanese, which is a word for perverted forms of sexuality. Sadly, anime is extremely dangerous, and many families, homeschool families, Christian families, are not aware of some of the hidden messages that are contained within the hentai or within the anime thing. But here's the point that I think I wanted to make, is that this is what makes it so dangerous, is that if you're objectifying a female, even a cartoon character, you have just pretty much objectified the whole female race. Does that make sense? In other words, now every female has been objectified simply because you've objectified a female in a cartoon character generically. Same thing can happen to the male. So that's the point people forget, is that, okay, you're not objectifying a certain person with a certain name, but now you've, in one fell swoop, you have objectified and degraded the entire female race. I mean, don't do that, right?
Yeah.
That's not loving.
It's totally against what God created us to be, which, like you said, is to honor and serve and love one another. And when we really go back to that idea of every person is made in God's image, we are image bearers of Christ, that should impact the way we view one another. And that's the antithesis of pornography. Whether it's a cartoon character, it's a real life person on the screen, it still matters because we are not holding them up as people worthy because they're made in God's image. And I think that it's easy for us to brush things like anime aside and say, well, it's just a cartoon. Like, it's not that big of a deal. But what we have to understand is the training of the brain to see another person, male or female, as an object. Right. And that can start with just a cartoon character, like in video games, right? Video games are so often highly sexualized. Sure. And your child is playing that game with a sexualized image over and over, and the brain is being trained to believe, oh, that this person is no more than the sum of their sexualized body parts. And that is absolutely damaging.
Yeah, good point. You've got a section on recognizing soft porn, which is really what we're talking about here. And this is really critical because, and here's the deal, soft porn is sometimes harder to identify. You know, it sneaks in on you, right? And yet parents need to be able to talk to those issues because, you know, your average person who winds up in trouble visiting wrong websites usually starts with soft porn. I mean, right?
Yes.
You don't start with the triple X, quadruple X. Usually it starts with something more soft porn-ish. So really, parents need to be pretty well calibrated to discern that, right?
Yeah, and that actually is such a great segue back to your first example of your young grandsons seeing these images of women on the commercial not wearing very many clothes. And at 4, I would not introduce the term to them of, hey guys, this is soft porn. I would not say that to the 4-year-olds, but I would say, hey, I know what you're seeing is making you feel kind of uncomfortable and you're confused because we don't usually see people wearing so few clothes like that on a TV screen in a restaurant. And that is something that is not good for us to look at.
Okay.
It's not appropriate. And so if we see that, it's real simple. We can just look at each other and start having a conversation about something else. We don't have to look at what we're seeing on the screen. And I think when we do that, we're setting a standard for our kids that, number one, to listen to that discomfort they feel in their body and in their head, in their heart, that's saying this is not appropriate. It gives them a way out, something to do. Like, let's look at each other. Let's talk. Let's look away from what we see on the screen.
And let's not be afraid to talk about this.
Yes. And it also sets the standard of saying, hey, people should be wearing more clothes and to be showing that much of their body is not appropriate and behaving in this suggestive manner. And that begins setting the standard of what soft porn is without even using the word until they're older and they're ready to have that level of conversation. But it begins to set the stage of, hey, this is not appropriate. And here's an easy way for us to handle that.
Right. Now let's talk about thoughtful uses of technology for 2-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds. You have an entire chapter on this. So important to address this even as early as 2, 3, 4 years of age. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I always believe that it is the ideal to give our kids a childhood that is not tethered to a screen.
Okay.
And when we give them that childhood, that helps clear up a lot of the problems of access to things that they shouldn't see. And so really we want to create opportunities for them to not be on screens all the time, to make real life more appealing than the screen.
Yeah.
And then as they get older and they do need to be on screens, whether it's for fun because we use screens for entertainment, we don't have to make screens the bad guy, but to teach them to use it well. So, one of the problems with watching, like, for example, YouTube videos, and that can be on kids' YouTube or adult YouTube. Ideally, please don't let your kids be on adult YouTube unsupervised, but there's no end to the shows. It's just constantly suggesting the next show. And that becomes problematic because then a kid doesn't know when to stop, right? They just want to watch continuously. So having a conversation about that and setting the expectation, we're only watching one, teaching them to understand what is happening and then putting a limit on things. And then as your kids get older, teaching them wise screen rules. Like, if you need to do a Google search, come tell me, Mom, I want to look this up. And mom sits down with them and looks it up with them. And they know ahead of time what to do if something pops up on the screen that is inappropriate. And then as they get a little older, they say, Mom, I need to look this up. Is that okay? And mom doesn't have to sit next to them because maybe they're 13 now and they need to have some responsibility and the ability to do it on their own, but you're still in the same room and mom might come check. What are you looking at? So creating those kinds of norms of how your family uses technology as a tool, as entertainment, but with limits, how to use it safely, those are all great ways for us to interact with technology in a wise and thoughtful and safer way.
The other thing I was thinking as, our children get older, and really even when they're younger, we need to be able to speak to the heart of how they are responding themselves to the images. Or, hey, the problem is that all of us have a problem with coveting, wanting that thing which does not belong to us. And just having those open and honest conversations about, how easily it is to get drawn into these tempting devices and such. And obviously this isn't the only problem we have in raising kids. There's other things that happens as well. So I guess to get to the heart of the matter and being able to get to heart deep conversations is really a big goal, isn't it?
Yeah, and I love that you brought that up, because we don't want to only present the bad to our kids. Mm-hmm. We want to remind them and really always come back to the truth is that God created marriage, men and women, sexual intimacy for a husband and a wife, and it is not a bad thing. Mm-hmm. It is a good thing. It is his design, and it is a gift that he created for the confines of marriage. And if we bring our kids back to that truth over and over again, and we're reminding them they are made in God's image, their body is beautifully created by God for a purpose, and that purpose eventually will be marriage, having children, loving their spouses, bringing them back to that truth over and over again, instead of just saying, hey, there's bad stuff out there. Porn is bad. There's explicit material. Be afraid. It's dangerous. Filling them with fear is not our goal. Our goal is to say that is what Satan wants to do to God's good gift. He wants to distort it. He wants to wreck it. He wants to take away from you what God wanted to give you that was good. Mm-hmm. And having that as our frame of reference for our kids, I believe, is a powerful way for us to reject Satan and his lies.
And you have a section on when they fall down, when we fall down, when we sin. When we fall for his traps, there's redemption. There's still redemption. There's confession. There's let's get it on the table. Let's realize this is why Jesus came, to take care of this. He is a Savior, and he came to save us from this. That message, we just got to bring that redemptive message to our kids at every point.
That's so important, because as parents, if our kids are exposed to pornography, and especially if they're using pornography, even a little or a lot, we can feel such shame ourselves. We can feel disappointment. We can feel anger, our own sadness, all of those things. But what we want to do is we want to use that moment to point them to Jesus, to help them see their need for him, and that there is no sin so great that he cannot redeem them from it.
That's absolutely true.
And to point them to that truth in that moment is the most important thing we can do for them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Folks, our guest today, Greta Eskridge, she is the author of It's Time to Talk to Your Kids About Porn, a parent's guide to helping children and teens develop sexual integrity. Greta, we just scratched the surface on this, but we appreciate the work you've put into this, and we just pray God will bless this to, millions of parents who can just, treat the subject well and to bring their kids to Jesus, because that's what we all need. So thank you.
Thanks for being willing to have the conversation with me. It's so important. And I'm just praying that the people who are listening today will have been served well to shepherd their kids' hearts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. And we'll be back in just a moment.